Recording. We now started recording. Now we're going live on 3, 2, 1.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everybody, and welcome to the National Hispanic and Latino ATTC's webinar, Latino Immigration, Cultural Trauma, and Cultural Complex. Today's webinar will be presented by Dr. Salvador Treviño, Director of Practicum Doctoral Program in Clinical Psychology from Antioch University in Santa Barbara, but I will tell you more about him soon. During today's webinar, all participants will be muted. The audio will be streamed to the computer. So please make sure that your computer speakers are turned on and off to hear today's presentation. Okay, so now we're going to review a few housekeeping items with everyone. If you notice that your viewer does not fit your screen, you can expand it by clicking the expand button located in the top right corner indicated by the red arrow. And here it is. Also, you can collapse the GoToWebinar toolbar on the right of your screen by clicking on the small red arrow on the left of the toolbar. And there you go. And then click the arrow again to expand the toolbar and it will expand. Great. As I mentioned, for today's webinar, all participants will be muted as we move through the presentation. If you have a question for our presenter, we ask that you use the chat box on the toolbar. Simply type your question and hit send. We can pause for our presenter to address questions at an appropriate time during today's presentation. And again, we will leave some time for questions at the end of the presentation. Also, a recording of today's webinar along with the PowerPoint slides will be available at our website at www.attcnetwork.org/Hispanic-Latino. Approximately 1 week from today, you can also find recordings and PowerPoint slides from all of our past webinars at the same URL. One NADAC, one NBCC, and one ICNRC continuing education credit is available for those who attend today's live event. So if you're interested in obtaining CEUs from these organizations, please email us at hispaniclatino@uccaribe.edu. Today's webinar is sponsored by the National Hispanic and Latino ATTC, as we mentioned at the beginning. As of October 1st of 2012, the network has been restructured and now consists of 10 regional ATTCs, 4 national focus area ATTCs, along with the network coordinating office. As you can see by this map, the ATTC network regions were realigned to better fit the current HHS regions. And the 4 national focus area ATTCs, you can see that are listed on the left of the screen. So today's webinar is the 12th in a series that the National Hispanic and Latino has been offering. The ATTC network is funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, and serves a critical role in improving the health of the United States. The network achieves this by translating, disseminating, and promoting the adoption and implementation of evidence-based clinical practices and strives to improve the health and wellness of individuals whose lives have been impacted by substance use disorders. Also, I want to mention that the National Hispanic and Latino ATTC has a national conference coming up in October 8th and 9th. It will take place at the University of Texas in Austin. The title of the conference is Integrating Research, Education, and Services to Reduce Behavioral Health Disparities in Hispanic and Latino Populations. We want to invite everyone to attend. It will be a great learning experience. Dr. Salvador Treviño, who is our presenter today, will be presenting on the subject that is being spoken about today. So it will be a presentation that will further explore the immigration and cultural trauma and cultural complex. So the conference objectives and program are based on the fundamental assumption that Hispanic and Latino populations have behavioral health disparities. So the conference will benefit participants as it promotes an understanding of these disparities in services to Hispanic and Latino populations in need for access to quality substance use treatment. So we're giving priority to the areas, the geographic areas, community service organizations, and workforce members. In the process, the conference will also promote the achievement of systems transformation, and we hope that disparities will be reduced. So if anyone is interested in participating, you can go to our website and you will have more information. As I mentioned, the ATTC's network is funded by SAMHSA. SAMHSA strives to reduce the impact of substance use and mental illness in America's communities through its program and services, and demonstrates that behavioral health is essential, that prevention works, that treatment is effective, and that people do recover from mental and substance use disorders. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Dr. Trevino. Dr. Trevino works at the Untitled University of Santa Barbara. He's the director of practicum for the doctoral program in clinical psychology, and is part of the clinical faculty. Dr. Trevino has taught professional psychology for over 15 years and lectures extensively on the theories and practices of psychoanalytic psychotherapy, primitive mental states, and Latino mental health. Drawing on his scholarship of more than 35 years of clinical work with Latino immigrants, Dr. Trevino is active in furthering the national conversation on cultural diversity, Latino historical trauma, the psychology of racism, and matters of social justice from a psychoanalytic perspective. Dr. Trevino is a full clinical member of the American Psychological Association, California Psychological Association, National Latino Psychological Association, and California Latino Psychological Association. Dr. Trevino is licensed as a psychologist and marriage and family therapist. He maintains a private practice in Santa Barbara. Okay, so now we're going to do our poll questions. And the purpose of the questions, we have a few questions so that Dr. Trevino can learn a little bit more about our audience. And also we have some pre-measures. So the first question, do you currently serve Hispanic and Latino populations with substance use disorders? 100% say yes, no? Okay. 80% yes, 20% no. Are you planning to serve Hispanic and Latino populations with substance use disorders in the next 6 months? So we have 75% yes. Which field of work do you represent? We have 59% mental health, 27 substance use, 15 education, 4 primary care, and 8 policy and political affairs. What is your current professional role? Um, 55%, counselors, therapists, 20% social worker, 12% students, and 4 nurse physicians. What type of setting do you currently work in? We have 36% substance use treatment, inpatient or outpatient, 25% psychiatric facility, 18% primary care unit, and 20% managed care organization, and 16% university. Okay, so now we're gonna turn over the control of the screen to Dr. Trevino so he can proceed with his presentation. And again, thank you, everybody.
As Dr. Orovich was mentioning, I've been involved in the field of psychology for approximately 35 years, mostly working with Latino families in various community mental health centers. I am an analytically trained psychologist as well as an analytically trained marriage and family therapist. I teach, I supervise, I train doctoral students to be clinical psychologists. I want to begin this presentation by acknowledging the previous presenters who have done seminars for this organization. I also want to acknowledge those that will follow me, and I feel very privileged that I've been asked to participate in this webinar. I had an opportunity to review some of the previous webinars just to kind of calm my nerves down, and I realized that a lot of very good scholarship is being produced by Latino scholars, and I'm very impressed by that. So I feel very grateful to be among that community. I also want to acknowledge and give a shout out to all the mental health workers in community settings. There are many professionals and paraprofessionals that quietly and unassumingly go about their business helping clients and families. They do this work with steadiness, with dignity, with integrity, and certainly with confidence. They are the persons that clients ask for by name. They are the ones that are sought by psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, case managers, when clients are difficult to reach and require close monitoring. When there is a need for translation, or when there is a need for grassroots fundraising. Those in the audience who work in community agencies understand the grassroots fundraising part. These workers have a steady stream of referrals for assistance. It is a testament to their credibility and knowledge. These are the individuals who are the backbone of community-oriented work. They intuitively create and provide the temenos, the sacred space where healing takes place. A simple example of this are the workers who are currently volunteering to assist with the crisis at the border by staffing emergency shelters in Texas, California, Oklahoma, and elsewhere. To these workers, I thank you for doing the difficult work that must be done. This morning's presentation is on Latino mental health, the inherent trauma of Latino immigration, and the exacerbation of these traumata by racially based social interactions with the dominant culture. My theoretical frame is phenomenological and psychoanalytic. Simply put, people are experts in their own lived experiences. Knowledge can be constructed by listening to people describe their lived experiences. And the idea that objectivity is the only source of knowledge, I want to challenge that, because subjectivity, the philosophy of phenomenology that puts an emphasis on understanding and allowing the person to express their feelings and their thoughts. It's important for me that I present that point of view. So when we talk about evidence-based practices, I'm not only including the empirically based interventions and research, I'm also including the phenomenologically based, those that emphasize meaning and understanding. Okay? I will also be presenting de-identified case material to integrate theory with clinical practice and ground my conceptualizations with real people in real-life situations. By no means am I presenting the entire corpus of literature on immigration, on trauma, racism, and cultural competency in clinical practice. I am presenting what I believe are noteworthy conceptualizations from notable scholars in Latino mental health, immigration, and death psychology, as well as my own perspectives and conceptualizations that I have gleaned over a 35-year clinical career in community mental health, and in particular Latino mental health. Okay. Slide number 2, please. Okay. There's going to be 5 sections to my presentation. The first one is Latino immigration, a psychological event. Number 2, I'm going to expand on migration and trauma. That would then lead me to discuss historical and cultural trauma in reference to shared emotionality. I will then talk about how historical trauma and cultural complexes are expressed in clinical situations, and I will end with treatment considerations. Okay. Slide number 3, please. How many Latinos are there in the U.S.? Presently, there are 54 million Latinos living here in America. That's 17% of the American population. 64% of Latinos living here are American born. Now, this is, if you are listening to news stations, if you are listening to some of the pundits on TV, it would make you believe that most of the Latinos living here in America are not American born. Statistics say something else. 33 million are of Mexican descent, with nearly half living in California and Texas alone. By the year 2060, it is expected that the population of Latinos living in the U.S. will increase to 35% of the total population. These numbers are substantial, and it goes without saying that we Latinos as a community yield tremendous political and voting clout. I hope you don't forget that. Slide number 4, please. Notable scholar and stress and emotion, Richard Lazarus, says that moving from one society and culture to another produces a level of stress that is profound and impacts a person's sense of well-being. Now, imagine what a community of immigrants is collectively experiencing. People migrate for various reasons. Sometimes it is economical, and at other times it is because of violence of war and genocide. All one has to do is read the headlines printed in any major newspaper in America to realize that a large number of people from Asia, Africa, Europe, Latin America, and the Pacific Rim are migrating, either legally or illegally. Some people migrate to escape social, political, and religious persecution. And as I said, while others are trying to escape crushing poverty and cartel violence. The latter is the case we currently see, with more than 57,000 children who have trekked through perilous terrain to reach El Norte. Incidentally, for the audience, the film El Norte, I don't know how many of you have had an opportunity to see this film, but I encourage you to see this film. It is an exquisite, emotionally moving, and disturbingly accurate depiction of the perils of immigration from the point of view of the Salvadorian mother making her way to the north. I encourage members of the audience to view this film. Notwithstanding the various reasons for migration, the decision to migrate directly challenges and disrupts the cultural elements that give meaning and context to one's lived experiences. Cultural uprooting is extremely stressful, taxing a person's ability to cope. Many immigrants live as stateless pariahs, struggling to live with dignity and integrity in a new country that often misunderstands and marginalizes them by rejecting their language, their skin color, their music, their food, their art, their style of dress, ethnicity, race, and certainly religious identification. Now, try living in a community that perceives your foreignness as menacing, and it infuses it with messages of danger that threatens the dominant culture's racial, emotional, and economic survival, despite strong evidence to the contrary. This misunderstanding in many cases rests on what some psychoanalytic scholars have identified as derivatives of stranger anxiety, most commonly seen in infants between the ages of 6 to 8 months. In this dynamic, the nascent ego of the infant is threatened by newness, to the stranger, and retreats to what is familiar, that is the mother. On a more broader, more social, more cultural level, more collective level, the collective ego of the dominant culture feels threatened by the strange-looking immigrants, so it retreats to what is culturally familiar and desirable, often to extreme social, political, and religious conservatism. Like enduring familial conflicts that damage the morale of family members, prejudice and hostility corrode the morale of immigrants and members of the dominant culture in a self-reinforcing, cyclical manner. I want to give some definitions here to culture. For the purpose of this presentation, culture is defined as a system of meaning and values, norms, behaviors, language, and history that is passed on from one generation to the next through socialization and participation in groups, organizations, and institutions. The second meaning of culture as it is used in this presentation comes from psychologist, scholar, and notable author on multiculturalism, Pamela Hayes. She says that culture is a tradition of thought, behavior, and emotion. A tradition of thought, behavior, and emotion. I'll come back to this. Thus, cultural dislocation significantly disrupts and stresses our tradition and system of making meaning in our lives. This psychological disruption is significant, and it is expressed through a variety of stresses. Psychological injuries is what I'm referring to. Common of these stresses or injuries is separation anxiety, cultural and moral anxieties, and most common, persecutory anxieties. Separation anxieties are seen when individuals worry about leaving behind familiar and meaningful surroundings, family, relatives who remain in the old country. Physical and psychological separations are quite painful, regardless of whether the separation is anticipated or not. In terms of cultural and moral anxieties, there are stresses over split loyalties. This is seen when material comfort, liberal gender roles, and related and relaxed social interaction between the sexes may trigger guilt when these social and cultural values conflict with more conservative cultural views from the immigrant's country of origin. And as I mentioned, most common are persecutory anxieties. And this is seen when an individual is confronted, threatened with new languages, customs, and social expectations, and in particular, racism. I'm going to stop here, and I want to ask for you to forgive me because I need to check in with my IT person, and I'm going to allow him to lead because I'm in control now of the show. Thank you very much. Okay. In terms of mood disorders, loss secondary to cultural uprooting and immigration ushers in grief and mourning and depression in the individuals, regardless of their reason for migration. I want to emphasize that. Regardless for their reasons for migration, whether it's voluntary or involuntary, it creates a great deal of stress. Anxiety, grief, mourning, and depression, and the sequelae of cultural dislocation constitute what Latino psychoanalytic scholars Leon and Rebecca Grinberg refer to as the psychopathology of migration. The psychopathology of migration. When a community of immigrants share the same experiences of loss, of grief, of mourning, secondary to cultural dislocation, moving from one place to another, it becomes what Latino psychoanalyst Ricardo Ainsley calls cultural mourning. Cultural mourning, it's a very powerful word. There is little doubt among the lay and professional communities that migration is a psychological event with profound impact on one's psyche. Presently, the number of humans moving from one country to another is at its highest that it has ever been in the history of the world. These numbers are likely to go up as large groups of people move from one place to another in response to war, ethnic cleansing, genocide, political and religious persecution, and global warming. Despite the stresses of migration that migration creates, migration is woven throughout our cultural fabric. To migrate is to be human. Migratory experiences are often embedded with myths and fairy tales. This is part of our cultural makeup. Myths and fairy tales are cultural portals to universal psychological, emotional, and behavioral patterns of humankind, often in allegorical form. Death psychology refers to these universal patterns as archetypes. In myths and fairy tales, there is an archetypal journey of some sort into what is unknown, mysterious, and sometimes perilous. There is the departure from the familiar, followed by a psychological upheaval inherent in encountering new lands, new languages, new customs. A profound and permanent psychological transformation ensues for the protagonists of these myths and fairy tales as a result of these journeys. These myths and fairy tales can be taken as stories of psychological transformation and migration. This is the hero's journey. This is the immigrant's journey, the happily ever after that fairy tales often refer to when there is psychological integration. In terms of myth, the first migration then would date back to Adam and Eve. Moved by curiosity as symbolized by the serpent, they entered the prohibited area of paradise, where they found the tree of knowledge and ate of its fruit. For their action, they were driven out, losing paradise with all its gratifications and conditions of security and pleasure. These words are taken from Dr. Grinberg's very moving conceptualization. Here we see the movement from naive dependency to mature awareness. It is psychologically migratory, perhaps a parallel process to what happens to Latino dreamers who want to finish their education, eat from the tree of knowledge, but are threatened with deportation. This is, perhaps there are members of the audience who can articulate this parallel process better than what I just did, but it's very captivating to me. In the myth of Tower of Babel, the urge to migrate is expressed in the desire to reach heaven in order to attain knowledge of another world, different from the known world. But desire is punished with the confusion of tongues and the destruction of the power to communicate. Again, these are the words that come from Dr. Grinberg in describing the migratory experience. This is the immigrant experience as it is captured by myth and fairy tales. Progressive withdrawals from objects, parents, and other familiarities appear to be a necessary condition for psychological migration or psychological maturation to proceed. We migrate when, as infants, we wish to leave the relative safety of our mother's arms to explore the surroundings. Separation, individuation is all about migration. I am taking this concept from Margaret Muller. I encourage those in the audience who have not read any of her work to go ahead and do that. The psychological birth of the human infant is a very powerful body of scholarship. Thus, to migrate is to be human. It is what we do physically and psychologically. It is also what we do as members of the animal kingdom. Latino scholar, psychologist, and chair of Division 7 of the California Psychological Association's Diversity and Social Justice. Ruth Gutkind says that the traumatization impact of the experiences of migration and acculturation can place this population at high risk for ongoing psychological deterioration. Psychological deterioration. When we immigrate, when we migrate, it puts us at high risk for ongoing psychological deterioration. The psychopathology of immigration is influenced by the immigrant's pre-morbid functioning. I want to acknowledge that. An immigrant with pre-existing psychiatric conditions, poor familial support, and the lack of cultural awareness will certainly have a more difficult adjustment period compared to an immigrant who arrives in this country confident of their ethnic, cultural, familial, and religious identity. In discussing loss and mourning as a psychological event, Dr. Ainsley says it is an experience that creates an emptiness that remains an emptiness despite our great efforts to fill it. These irresolvable gaps become paradoxical, the very means through which we perpetuate our attachment to those whom we have lost. In its own way, he says, mourning negates loss. The attachment remains emotionally alive so long as it is mourned. Immigration creates losses that are permanent and irrecoverable. Eventually, one learns to live with loss and memories of what was. These memories soon fade from consciousness but are kept alive in the unconscious in a compensatory process to memorialize what the conscious mind forgets. I'll return to this concept a bit later when I present case material. What Dr. Ainsley says is also echoed by a professor of family science at the University of Minnesota and psychotherapist Pauline Boss. She calls the first chapter in her book ambiguous loss, frozen grief. This refers to the loss that seemingly is in a perpetual state of incompleteness. For Latino immigrants, this ambiguous loss is frozen in a perpetual state of incompleteness. Okay? This is linked to immigration as a psychological event and is characteristic of enduring cultural trauma. Unless people resolve this ambiguous loss that is inherent in uprooting and bring into some congruence their psychological and physical families, the legacy of frozen grief may affect their offspring for generations to come. I want to say that again. The legacy of frozen grief may affect their offspring for generations to come, compounding itself as more ordinary losses inevitably occur. This is the legacy of frozen grief. This is the legacy of immigration that lies at the root of many personal and family problems that we see in our treatment rooms. Of all the losses, ambiguous loss is the most devastating kind because it remains vague. From a First Nation indigenous perspective, unmitigated grief eventually becomes a loss of soul. As my mother would say, la alma está perdida. I want to expand on migration and trauma. A person's core resilience, as well as one's family upbringing, will certainly impact the outcome of migration. Close proximity of the country of origin and the ability to return to one's country of origin all contribute to the adjustment or lack of adjustment to living in a new society or a new country. Harm occurs when stress is prolonged and unmitigated. In these situations, stress becomes trauma. Trauma is defined as a psychological injury that overtaxes the person's ability to bear the weight of stress. Coping is no longer functional. The psychological structures such as problem solving, appraisals of stress, memory, self-confidence, etc., these that are used to cope with stress become ineffective. They become fatigued and buckle under the psychological and emotional strain. The captivating short story collection by Latina author Cristina Enriquez, titled The Book of Unknown Americans. I highly recommend that book to you. It illustrates the daily psychological and emotional stresses endured by Latino immigrants living in New Jersey. It's very poignant. Again, I highly recommend this book to you. Stress increases and the daily stresses are ambiguous. Okay. For example, being kept waiting before being served. If the daily stresses are negative, not knowing the language, social expectations that are very different from what you are used to. If the stresses are unpredictable, misunderstanding public transportation. For those of you who work with Latinos, and for those of you who give free public transportation passes, you have heard the story before. Pues no sabía qué camión iba que tomar, no sabía si era el número 3 o el número 4, y fíjese que llegué y ni sabía en dónde estaba. This is quite common. And of course, there is the language and the money, the legal tender system here in America. If you're coming from another country, our dollars look strange. The way we exchange, the way we engage in commerce may be unfamiliar to the immigrant. And these are the daily stresses. Stress is greater if there are problems and conflicts related to the central role in one's life. Cultural dislocation and social uprooting impacts parenting, vocational identity, work and school functioning. These are the issues that immigrants deal with on a daily basis. A Latino father or mother committed to supporting his or her family may not find work that is meaningful for their accepted roles as providers. The husband may discover that his wife has an easier time finding employment, and in so doing, his central role as a family provider is directly challenged, creating stress for the individual, couple, and family. For those of you who work with Latinos, this is very familiar to you. Those in the audience understand this dynamic quite well. If you're working with Latinos or you're working with immigrants in community agencies, this is quite common. Coping strategies and their adaptational outcomes result from how both groups, immigrants and the indigenous population, the dominant culture, perceive and react to each other. Okay? Migration would fall into the category of the so-called cumulative and tension traumas, with reactions that are not always spectacular, but with profound and lasting effects. Here are some examples of what I mean by cumulative and tension. I want to introduce my first case material. The first case material comes from a 37-year-old Latina immigrant who on intake complained about insomnia, poor concentration, and a general feeling of melancholia, me dice. She sought counseling, she sought consejos to help resolve what she referred to as estos nervios. Y esta tristeza que ni sé por qué me pega. The patient was insomniac for approximately 6 months. She was able to nap during the day, and this allowed her to be alert during working hours. But she wanted, however, to return to a full night's sleep. And she said something very interesting to me when she said, I want to return and have a full night's sleep. She says, pero sin esos sueños, not without those dreams. Being analytically trained, I immediately started asking about that. When I asked about her immigration experience, the patient responded, gracias a Dios, nada me pasó. Thank God, nothing happened. As it turned out, the memory of the trauma of her immigration experience had been repressed and found expression in her dreams. While she denied any residual impact of immigration, her dreams revealed something else, namely that she was not done with this experience, as evidenced by her emotional response to the telling of her dream. I am in a bus station crowded with people, she says. I am standing in line. When it is my turn to buy a ticket, the woman selling tickets tells me I can no longer go back. My suitcase is stolen, and I have nothing to wear. I feel my pocket and realize that my wallet has been stolen. How am I going to prove I am who I am? I have no money. Powerful images. Multiplicity of meanings inherent in dream material. When I work with dreams and I work and I discussing, or the patient is discussing dreams with me, I follow a couple of rules. Rule number one, the person having the dream is the sole author of that dream. And because they are the author of that dream, they have sole authority over the meaning of that dream. As I mentioned before, knowledge can be constructed by listening to people describe their lived experiences. When our cultural identity is shaken, the affective and psychological reverberations are profound. The experience of loss of self is often captured in dreams with rich images that only the fecundity of the unconscious mind can produce. My second illustration comes from the treatment of a middle-aged Latino immigrant male in country for approximately 20 years. He came to treatment complaining of vague body aches that had been medically cleared through extensive testing. He came to treatment complaining that he wanted to speak with someone who understands Spanish. Two physicians concluded that the patient was suffering a type of conversion disorder and referred the person to a psychiatrist. Psychiatrist then referred the patient to me. Once again, when the patient was asked about his immigration experience, he denied any residual trauma. When I asked how he was sleeping, the patient reported recurring pesadillas, nightmares, or images of pure anxiety. Before I show you the second case material, let me bring to your attention once again the text psychological theory that the unconscious is in a compensatory relationship with the conscious mind. Simply put, what the conscious mind denies, the unconscious mind registers and keeps the memory alive in symbolic form. Dreams not only represent the personal psychology of the dreamer, they also contain references to the collective, social, cultural, and psychological experiences of a community of people. In this regard, dreams have a socio-cultural significance that appear to arise from the individual's emotional experiences of the social environment in which he or she lives and works. In the second dream, the patient tells me, I am walking in the desert at night. It is very cold and dark. I cannot see my hands and feet. It is so black. I feel the rocks under my shoes as I walk. I realize that there are others with me. I know them, but they are strangers to me. Suddenly, a loud explosion. I am terrified. I am alone. And the patient says, I yell, Ama! Again, powerful images. I am still impressed by how creative the unconscious mind is. This patient, as I mentioned before, denied any residual impact from his immigration. When he shared the pesadilla, the recurring pesadilla, the nightmare, this is it. I asked him about the immigration experience. Psychoanalysis tells us trauma is made tolerable by mourning. Immigrants who are unable to successfully grieve and mourn their trauma become chronically symptomatic, leading to a variety of syndromes ranging from depression, suicidality, substance abuse, poor school functioning, to domestic violence and gang activity. The patient in the second dream began to feel somewhat better when his immigration experience was discussed, and he began to connect the dots. The patient had not fully grieved and mourned his losses when he came to live in the U.S. I'm going to expand on cultural trauma and historical trauma. I want to talk about that. Immigrants are excluded and marginalized because of racism, prejudice, and discrimination. Stress from daily microaggressions are omnipresent in the lives of immigrants of color. An example of this was recently on display and captured by news media as a busload of immigrant children and women was blocked and forced to return to where It originated by a group of citizens in Murrieta, California. They were determined to keep the illegals out of their country. The irony was this busload of children and women were refugees, escaping the crushing poverty and drug cartel violence of their home countries of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. They fit the description of the poem, The New Colossus, written by Emma Lazarus in 1883, that is inscribed on a tablet in the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty. And I want to read what that poem says. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, the tempest tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. This busload of immigrants, refugees, was sent back. We don't want you here. Okay. The very people that this country invited to come over here. Things have changed. Why is that? Okay. I associate now to the stranger anxiety. Okay. I want to bring that to your attention. When a group of individuals share similarly enduring emotional and psychological traumatic experiences, a collective trauma and collective complex begins to emerge, no different from personal complexes. This collective trauma and the collective complex are not always available to explore in psychotherapy, but can be the source of therapeutic impasses, negative transferences, premature termination, and certainly acting out that can limit the progress of psychotherapy. A psychological complex refers to interconnected images, emotions, melancholias, memories, behaviors clustered around a psychological core that has significance to the individual. A psychological complex of interconnected images. I refer to the dreams. In the immigrant patients that I am referring to, the psychological core is ambiguous loss and non-resolved mourning, secondary to the immigration experience. The CBTers in the audience will recognize this concept to be similar to Beck's cognitive schemas. The impact of collective trauma from immigration is made worse when the social forces surrounding the community of Latinos are abusive, racist, and prejudiced against them. I want to highlight that. Here we see the legacy of historical trauma and the cumulative tension effects of shared emotionality. Examples of these types of stressors that confront Latino immigrants, as I mentioned before, include the daily slights and insults directed at them because of being a person of color, speaking another language, or speaking English with an accent. Others include restricted housing, unemployment, discrimination, poverty, and assault. Make no mistake, these daily covert and overt microaggressions contribute to depression. It contributes to the anxiety, and it contributes to a decline in physical health. They exacerbate the psychopathology of immigration. Writing on the Mexican historical trauma, Italian scholar and Jungian analyst Luigi Zoggia wrote, "We know that the abused lose their will to live, and we can, through intuition, understand why so many Mexicans committed suicide, infanticide, or simply stopped fighting diseases during the decades that followed." I'm going to expand on what Dr. Zoggia said and include all of Latin America and other countries that have been conquered. The shared emotionality and the collective experience of brutality at the hands of the conquistadores contributed significantly to the collective melancholia commonly expressed in idioms and expressions. Pues, ¿qué vamos a hacer? Pues así es la vida, ¿no? Así es la cosa. My favorite, pues no hay otra. Tenemos que luchar. These are the expressions in response to tirelessly working. There appears to be a sense of cultural and collective fatalism common among Latinos and other colonialized First Nation people. The carefully researched and eloquently articulated book by notable Latino scholars and historians Francisco Valderrama and Raymond Rodriguez, Decade of Betrayal, looks at how institutionalized racism against Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans expressed itself in the 1930s. Over 1 million Mexicans, of whom over half were children and U.S. citizens, were forced to leave their homes, jobs, schools, and deported to Mexico, where they did not receive a hero's welcome. Does this sound eerily familiar with what is happening at the border? Incidentally, in the gathering, the model that was used in rounding up Latinos, bringing them all together, putting them on trains, putting them on buses, putting them on taxis that LA County paid for, putting them in cars, even walking. This model was so effective that it became the model for the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. The Zoot Suit riots of the 1940s impacted Latinos and Black communities across America, but most notably in Los Angeles. In these riots, military and civic police went searching for Mexican American men wearing zoot suits and assaulted them with the blessings of local and federal authorities. Often Mexicans were stripped of their tacuches, their suits, and subjected to profound humiliation, as we see here in this photo. The memories of this historical trauma live in our collective psyche. We don't forget. The conscious mind may forget, but the unconscious mind, in a compensatory relationship with consciousness, will register those events. The list is by no means complete. The violence and historical trauma committed by dominant cultures against Latinos, Native Americans, Asians, Europeans, Africans, Muslims, and Christians is seemingly endless. Here is the legacy of historical and enduring trauma. It becomes a psychological tradition of thought, behavior, and mood. Since tradition is culture, as Dr. Hayes tells us, these collective experiences become a cultural trauma, cultural complex. It becomes part of who we are, at least how we come to be and how we see ourselves. This may be familiar to some of you in the audience. This is a very popular tattoo that I would often see in the youngsters that I worked with when I was working with the juvenile justice system. You also see this in gang members. You also see this in non-gang members. It is the masks of drama, tragedy and comedy. Smile now, cry later. The melodies, lyrics, well, mostly from Motown, are very popular among Latino youth. I'm talking about the doo-wops. The melodies, lyrics, and images of the 1940 pachucos and the low-riding caruchas wearing tattoos that say smile now, cry later, in my opinion, are tied to the historical trauma and the legacy of the Zoot Suit riots. These songs resonate with the Latino soul, expressing deep sorrow. It is the collective lament. Clinical professor of psychiatry at UCLA, Rita Rogers, said something very interesting, and I'm going to quote her. A generation can carry with it not only individual psychopathological remnants, such as trauma, depression, but also messages that it has been wrong, or it has been chosen, or it must act in a particular way as a group. The passage of time does not cure these emotional and moral burdens. It simply intensifies them. Trauma, too, is then passed on from one generation to the next in what Roger refers to as intergenerational transmission. Here again, we see cultural trauma as historical wrongs become infused with tradition. We pass them on. In the clinical setting, I began to explore other possibilities, especially when my clients were saying, I don't know why I feel like this, that ambiguous loss. Dream analysis becomes important because it allows you to access material that otherwise would not be accessible through ordinary clinical interviewing. This is among the many things that I find meaningful in psychoanalytic training. The free association allows this material to come up. According to research psychologists, Carter people can adapt to or experience strain as a result of ongoing stressful events. It is difficult for some people to adapt to these highly stressful events. Even after psychological adaptation to long-term strain, physical changes resulting from the stressful circumstances may continue and can impact psychological well-being. Said another way, when people seem to adapt to it, stress can still make you sick. The expression of cultural complex secondary to historical and immigration trauma. Here, how are we to understand the impact and meaning that immigration and historical trauma has on the psyche of the very people it impacts? The technical literature on the psychology of racism, historical trauma, and psychological and emotional injury secondary to race-based social interactions is substantial. Depression, anxiety, relational discord, behavioral problems with children, and other neuroses are common expressions of what can be generally called psychological and relational stress. Narratives of stress expressed in medical settings may reflect the sequelae of historical trauma. As psychologists, we need to be informed and we need to ask our patients. Immigrants and other people of color often express their stress in very similar ways that parallel post-traumatic stress. The research bears this out. The technical literature on PTSD and socially based interactions, the stress that comes from that, bears that out. In distinguishing ambiguous loss and PTSD, Dr. Voss says that unlike PTSD, it is not post anything. It continues. Simply put, people of color show symptoms of post-traumatic stress without the identifiable triggers commonly seen in combat veterans and victims of crime. As I mentioned before, dreams provide access to psychological conflicts that may not be accessible otherwise through conventional means, because the patient is well defended by repression and dissociation. These defenses need to be respected. Certainly through these defenses, the ego is attempting to maintain some psychological cohesion and prevent further traumatization. This is what we do when we're traumatized. We repress, we dissociate, we become symptomatic. To reiterate Jung, dreams appear to have a compensatory function to what the conscious mind denies. Jungian dream scholars believe that the unconscious mind is in compensation to the conscious mind. I want to say that because that's important. I'm repeating that. The general function of dreams is to try to restore our psychological balance by producing dream material that reestablishes in a subtle way the total psychic equilibrium. These are the words of the Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst C.G. Jung. Jungian analyst and dream scholar James Hall says about dreams, it is a natural regulatory psychic process, analogous to the compensatory mechanism of bodily functioning. Simply put, like the physical body, which seeks compensation whenever an injury is suspected, the psyche will recalibrate any imbalance between the external world and the internal world, for the psyche seeks to rest in balance. Thus, one conceptualization of the function of dreams is to find psychological adjustment to supplement what consciousness lacks. Jungian analyst and dream scholar Joseph Henderson introduced the concept of the cultural unconscious to identify that area of historical memory that lies between the collective unconscious and the manifest pattern of culture. All of the psychological experiences of a community of people that contribute to their cultural identity are embedded in the cultural unconscious and are projected externally as attitudes that exert tremendous influence over our perceptions, emotions, and behavior. The cultural unconscious appears in dreams and collective behavior with regularity. Dream images spontaneously bring forth cultural information that metaphorically reflects psychological changes, trauma, and other socially based experiences. Dream analysis is viable, and it is an important method of my clinical work with Latinos. Dreams have a mythopoetic imagery created by the psyche that is in essence linked to the sequelae of trauma. This much is clear to me, especially when one listens to the dreams that Latinos share in treatment. I want to present more case material to illustrate this conceptualization. The patient tells me, I am on the banks of what seems like a gentle stream. I know that I need to cross the water to get to the other side, where there is something appealing and necessary. I just don't know what it is. I walk into the stream and suddenly realize the current is so strong it nearly takes me. I swim to the other side where a dark, missing figure with machetes chases me back to where I come from, a la chingada. The dream says. Powerful images. Can you go back to powerful images? And I want to bring attention to the multiplicity of meanings and the symbology. What seems like a gentle stream, something appealing on the other side. The stream suddenly becomes strong and takes me, nearly takes me. Powerful images. Again, the patient who reported this dream was telling me that they had no residual impact of their migratory experience. Next one, please. I am walking in a line with many children. The landscape is very barren. We are being led by a man I do not trust. He is taking us somewhere I do not know, but I have no choice but to follow him. I try to find the strength to resist him, but he is much stronger than me. The man disappears, and I am filled with terror and isolation. The children are gone. Virgencita, ayúdame. Powerful images. This dream was shared way before the crisis at the border with the children. Before this news, before the stories that are now plastered all over the newspapers and images online and newscasts. Powerful images. Cultural trauma expressed in clinics, narratives of pain, expressed in medical settings may reflect this historical trauma, personal trauma. The patient may be rambling, nevertheless a narrative is being expressed and articulated. The rambling quality may be considered as possible dissociation. We are accustomed to focusing solely on the personal, with good reason I think, but as clinicians we sometimes fail to consider the presenting symptomatology is also due to the psychological trauma of the collective psyche. In terms of treatment considerations, next slide please. In terms of treatment considerations, the major theoretical premise underlying therapy is this: the greater the ambiguity surrounding one's loss, the more difficult it is to master it, and the greater one's depression, anxiety, and family conflict. This point is important to remember when our patients are in denial over their psychological injuries secondary to immigration. Culturally speaking, the significance of the temenos of rituals centers on the containment and holding capacity it offers. Temenos refers to the sacred space. Rituals are culturally based and provide a means of bearing witness, giving form to loss, grief, and mourning. If the patient does not seem to grieve and mourn losses, perhaps a clinician will do well to create collaboratively rituals that can give meaning to such trauma. Very specific techniques. It is important to maintain the dialectical tension between Western and First Nation interventions because both have tremendous merit. Techniques include testimonials, rituals, as I said, catharsis and insight, use of music and movement to build ritual and community, and certainly pláticas sagradas. Notable Latina scholar, psychologist, and author Celia Falakov advocates assisting our patients to give testimonials of their journeys. A testimonial, she says, involves a first-person oral and written account, perhaps recorded by the therapist or family members. It focuses on validating personal experiences of loss, trauma, and abuse. Those in the audience who work with trauma may recognize giving testimonials to be similar to a CBT technique of cognitive restructuring utilized in trauma therapy. Those of you who are practitioners of narrative therapy would recognize the value and power of writing your narrative and restoring a sense of agency by telling and retelling one's narrative and constructing a new narrative, one that is more empowering. We can help our Latino clients by creating a narrative that is more healing, more empowering. Additionally, immigrants can be helped to make meaning out of their experiences of separation and loss. This facilitates the appropriate expression of grief, mourning, and restores meaning and personal identity. Through meaning, we find purpose in our lives, and it enriches our experiences as human beings. There's also referrals to ethnic social organization clubs. Immigrant clients can be referred to these organizations for cultural events that sponsor cultural events. This helps restore, at least in symbolic form, the cultural object that has been lost. These organizations psychologically serve the same function as a Winnicottian transitional space in which loss of the object is simultaneously restored and the new experiences of transitioning is facilitated. Dr. Ainsley identifies flea markets as a transitional phenomenon, as a transitional space for immigrants. These are the flea markets where you have a lot of ethnic food, music, right next to the modern luxuries of living here in America. You see the two sides. Catharsis appears to be a universal healing agent found across cultures. This much is confirmed by research. A person who has confidence in the sacred space of psychotherapy and experiences the psychotherapist as knowledgeable and credible is likely to let out their internal processes that were repressed, to give them form, to allow the patient to experience them and understand them from a different perspective. Some call this insight. Still others call it the transcendent function of the psyche. This is a major tool in the work of grieving, mourning, and transformation. While catharsis is not always spectacular, it is nevertheless essential in our work, as this is the foundation of changing perspectives. Acceptance is another technique that I often use with working with Latinos, Latino immigrants in particular. Once attitude is changed, we change our attitude by changing our perceptions. For Latinos, this acceptance of circumstances may come across as fatalistic. Fatalism can also be conceptualized as the Latinos believe that their lives are being guided and impacted by forces greater than one's personal determination. Reframing becomes a method of assisting clients to shift their perspective, and in so doing creates psychological space that is potentially healing and potentially transformative. I want to tell the audience that it is important not to demonize one approach and idealize another, as there is no one approach to mental health that does it all. Research bears this out. Recognizing the value of maintaining dialectic between the First Nation epistemology on matters of mental health, causes of distress, and healing interventions. Maintaining that tension with Western approaches to mental health is really necessary, especially when one considers that some individuals respond better to one approach over another. Therapeutic alliance, in truth, is the critical factor here. The emphasis here is to focus on the universal healing conditions in a culturally specific context identified by the literature. The sine qua non of these healing conditions are the therapeutic alliance, articulating a shared worldview of illness and health, speaking the same language, acknowledging the archetypal nature of their migration. This helps establish credibility of the clinician as a knowledgeable, empathic healer who speaks the same language, who understands the political, social struggles in contemporary society. Ultimately, all of this contributes to an installation of hope in client expectations. I'm aware of the time, and I am going to just jump to my summary here and open it up to any questions that you may have. This presentation addressed Latino immigration, the psychology of immigration, cultural trauma, and cultural complex. It was a psychoanalytic phenomenological examination of Latino immigration as a psychological event. The stresses and trauma of migration and the impact these have on personal and the collective psyche of Latinos is significant. The immigrant experiences is intensified by the sequelae of historical trauma and race-based social interactions with the dominant culture. Clinical considerations that utilize Western evidence-based interventions as well as First Nation conceptualizations of psychopathology have been shown to facilitate positive change and strengthen psychological resilience with Latino immigrants in treatment. This presentation emphasized 3 principles of phenomenology. A person is the expert in his or her own lived experiences. Knowledge can be constructed by listening to people describe their lived experiences. And I am going to put fidelity to what the patient reports. Subjectivity is just as important as objectivity. It's not just what is observable, what can be calculated, what can be touched. It is also what the patient says and describes in their unique way that we can understand and build knowledge about the experiences of immigration. I end here. Thank you so very much. I want to just some slides, and you can go back to the previous slide. Patron saying of Mexican immigrants. Very popular. Very popular now. It has always been popular. This saying is getting a lot of attention because of what's happening at the border right now. Next one. Immigrants from Central America traveling on an infamous train known as the Beast, La Bestia. I look at these pictures and it angers me. The owner of this railroad, the conductors, all these people are being charged, by the way. Note that they are children. Note that they are not secure. People fall. People die. The next one. The archetype of immigrants is the stranger. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Trevino, for an excellent presentation. I'm going to take control of the screen now.
Okay. Do I need to do something over here?
No.
Okay.
Okay, so as you know, we're out of time. So what we're gonna do is that we're gonna do one question, and then the rest of the questions, what we can do is that we can post them on our website approximately 1 week from today. So I will send them to you, and as soon as I have the responses, then we can post them on the website for anyone who's interested, so that they can see them. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So the question I have is the therapist, does the therapist explain to the client that they might be experiencing changes in their state or in their moods, and that this might be related to an unresolved trauma experience?
Okay. I'm not sure if I'm understanding the question.
Okay.
Could you repeat that?
Sure. The person is asking if it is the therapist who explains to the client that they're experiencing changes in their mood states, and that these changes might be related to a trauma that hasn't been resolved.
I would say that both the personal and the collective reasons for being symptomatic needs to be explored.
Mm-hmm.
As I said before, we do not want to excuse personal decisions.
Mm-hmm.
We want to hold our patients accountable for their lives and the decisions that they make. Mm-hmm. Certainly not in a punitive way, but when a patient is experiencing symptomatology, and we begin to explore their experiential reasons, the experiences that they have. We are looking at the personal level as well as the collective level. So when I introduce the collective level, I typically say things like, some of the complaints that you had, some of the symptoms that you had, lo que usted me está diciendo, this is something that I've heard from others in a very similar way. Mm-hmm. What do you make of that? Mm-hmm. ¿Cómo piensa usted? Eso es lo que le pregunto a mi cliente. Mm-hmm. So it's introduced as a conceptualization as opposed to introducing it as a definite thing. Mm-hmm. Okay. Again, we need to be very careful that we do not override the psychological defenses. So we introduce it in a very benign way. Mm-hmm. I will say things like, I will explain something, and then I will then ask my client, my patient, I would say, maybe you can explain it better. Maybe you can use the words that are more meaningful to you. But I do acknowledge that it is my conceptualization and not theirs, but I introduce it as a point of discussion. Mm-hmm. I then rely on free association, a psychoanalytic technique that allows me to follow the patient. And typically what I am doing is following the emotion. Once a patient experiences emotion or expresses emotion, meaning has been created. Mm-hmm. And I'm interested in what meaning was created, what triggered the emotion in terms of the image or perception. Mm-hmm. Again, these are psychoanalytic techniques, but they're also techniques that are used by curanderos.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. I think that one of the things that you pointed out is the importance of the subjective experience. So what you're saying makes a lot of sense when we see it that way, because you, like you said, you introduce it in a benign way, and it is the patient who ultimately gives it meaning.
Es cierto.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Evidence-based interactions or interventions also include phenomenological evidence. Mm-hmm. We cannot dismiss phenomenology. We cannot dismiss subjectivity. Mm-hmm. It's difficult. It is more contemplative rather than calculating. Mm-hmm. Okay. Both approaches, Western and First Nation approaches to mental health, have merit, and we have to have those approaches yoked together. Not one approach is better than the other. I want to point out to the audience that research bears that out. Okay? Every approach, every model of psychotherapy has its strengths and it has its limitations. And we must be aware of both sides. Otherwise, the use of that particular model is being distorted if we don't recognize its limitations.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, so we don't have more time for questions, but again, I want to thank you. It was an excellent presentation, and I want to remind our audience that an electronic copy of today's PowerPoint and audio will be available at our website at www.attcnetwork.org/Hispanic Latino. So a few of our participants asked, yes, we will have a complete recording of today's session along with the PowerPoint slides. Also, people are asking if you could repeat the name of the documentary that you recommended.
Yes, I want to recommend two in particular. The first one is, it wasn't listed as a documentary, but as a commercial film. It's called El Norte. El Norte.
Okay.
And the second one that I will be presenting at the Austin conference is a documentary called Sin País, Without a Country.
Okay, perfect.
Images of trauma.
Mm-hmm. So what we'll do is that as we post the answers to our questions, we will also include the names of the films that you just recommended, El Norte and Sin País.
The audience can also contact me through the email that's on my lead slide. You can also contact me here at Antioch. Con mucho gusto, I will provide as much information as I can. If I don't have it, I'll provide where to go again.
Thank you. Okay. So also, your feedback is important to us. So at this time, you will be redirected to answer a few questions about today's webinar. And remember that if you're interested in obtaining one CEU from NADAC, NDCC, and or ICNRC, you may email us at hispaniclatino@uccaride.edu. Again, I want to remind everyone of our national conference, Integrating Research, Education, and Services to Reduce Behavioral Health Disparities in Hispanic and Latino Populations. It's going to take place on October 8 and 9 of 2014 at the University of Texas at Austin. It will be at the Commons Learning Center. So we have a webpage for a conference that you can visit and learn more about our presenters, like Dr. Salvador Trevino, who is going to be presenting on this subject. And the conference website is www.hispaniclatinoattcconference.com, and there you will find more information and of course, the registration information. So thank you, everybody, and have a great day.
Yes.
Gracias.